When the war ended, Germany lay in ruins. Cities were dust and bones. Fathers were dead, brothers were prisoners, and mothers scavenged for bread. The men who once strutted in uniform were gone. Defeated, broken, or buried under the rubble of their Reich, into this shattered world came the victors, young, confident, well-fed American soldiers with cigarettes, chocolate, and the strange smell of victory on their skin. And for the German girls who had grown up under Hitler's shadow, these men represented something forbidden yet intoxicating. Freedom, power, and the illusion of escape. What began as curiosity soon became something more dangerous. Love. But loving the enemy, in post-war Germany, came at a horrifying price. They called them Ami-Liebchen, Ami's little darlings. The name dripped with contempt. In the eyes of their countrymen, these girls had betrayed the blood of the fatherland. To fall into the arms of an American soldier was to dance with shame. Yet the hunger for warmth, the human need to be seen and touched after years of fear, drove thousands of young women into those risky embraces. They met in bombed-out cafes, in darkened alleys, behind military checkpoints, and sometimes even inside the ruins of their former homes. For a chocolate bar, for a can of meat, for a night of comfort. They gave what they had left, themselves. But for some it wasn't survival. It was genuine love. And that perhaps was the cruelest crime of all. In the months following Germany's surrender in May 1945, American occupation zones swarmed with desperate civilians. Food was scarce, power lines were dead, the moral fabric of the nation was torn to rags. The GIs, for all their swagger, were often lonely too. Boys barely out of their teens, thousands of miles from home, haunted by what they'd seen. When they looked at the German girls, they didn't see an enemy. They saw beauty in the ruins. They saw youth unbroken by war's ugliness. So they gave gifts, shared cigarettes, whispered promises. In a land where everything had collapsed, these small gestures felt like rebirth. But as soon as the community noticed, the smiles turned into stares, and the whispers into accusations. The punishment came swiftly. German women caught consorting with Americans were publicly humiliated. Their heads were shaved, their faces smeared with tar, and they were paraded through the streets to the laughter and jeers of neighbors. Sometimes they were forced to wear signs that read, "I betrayed Germany." Others were beaten, spat on, or had their families driven from their homes. The irony was bitter. Only months earlier, these same streets had cheered for a regime built on hate and obedience. Now they demanded purity again, not from ideology, but from vengeance. Society needed someone to blame for its collapse, and the women who loved the victors were easy targets. Not all relationships were condemned immediately. Some were hidden behind the thin curtains of ruined houses. The women wore American military jackets to stay warm, pretending they'd found them in the rubble. But every knock on the door, every glance from a neighbor carried danger. The Allied authorities discouraged fraternization at first. The US Army had strict non-fraternization orders, forbidding soldiers from even speaking to German civilians. But the rule was impossible to enforce. Within weeks, love, or at least the illusion of it, spread across the ruins like wildfire. By late 1945, the ban was quietly lifted. The Americans realized that peace could not grow from hatred forever. Yet for many women, the damage was already done. Some of the American soldiers married their German lovers. By 1946, the first war brides began to appear, young women leaving their devastated homeland behind to start new lives in the United States. But even that path was lined with pain. Many were shunned by both worlds, seen as traitors in Germany and as suspicious foreigners in America. Their pasts were questioned, their accents ridiculed, and the men who once whispered love to them often changed when the uniform came off. Some were abandoned in transit camps, clutching babies that bore the faces of men who would never return. For those left behind, the children became living reminders of forbidden love. The occupation children, born to German mothers and American fathers, faced their own cruel destiny. They were called Mischlingskinder, mixed children, and treated as outcasts. In a country obsessed with purity only a few years earlier, their existence reopened old wounds. Many mothers were pressured to give them up to orphanages. Others hid them, moving constantly to avoid ridicule. But despite the shame, these children carried a quiet truth. They were living proof that even amid hatred, humanity found ways to connect. Love had defied ideology, even if it cost everything. As time passed, the outrage faded, but the scars remained. Many women carried their secrets for decades, never speaking of the soldiers who once held them in the dark. Some kept letters hidden in old boxes, their edges worn from being touched in silence. Others never told their husbands or children. To love an American was to carry a memory that history did not want to remember, a memory wrapped in shame, tenderness, and survival. The archives tell of countless unnamed girls, their names erased, their stories whispered only in private kitchens or recorded in diaries never meant to be read. Behind the politics and the uniforms, there were real hearts beating in the ruins of Germany. A soldier from Kansas who gave his rationed sugar to a girl named Liesel, a medic who smuggled bread to a family whose father had died at Stalingrad, a translator who risked his position to protect the woman he loved from her own neighbors. These small acts of rebellion against hatred were never recorded in the official reports, yet they were the quiet foundations of post-war healing. But history, as always, remembers the spectacle, the shaven heads, the parades of shame, the mob laughter echoing through empty streets. The human part fades into the dust, and still, if you walk through Berlin's Tiergarten at dusk, or the ruins of Frankfurt's old quarters, you might feel it. The ghosts of a time when love was a crime, the footsteps of those who dared to care for the enemy, when caring meant exile. What happened to the German girls who loved American soldiers is more than a story of punishment. It's the story of a nation torn between guilt and desire, vengeance and forgiveness. In their eyes was the reflection of a world learning how to feel again, after forgetting what humanity meant. The war had ended, but for them, the battle to be accepted had only just begun. And as their laughter faded into silence, only the ruins remembered what it meant to love the enemy when the whole world demanded hate. The American soldiers brought more than victory. They brought a strange kind of hope to many German girls. These men were symbols of a world that still functioned, a world that had food, laughter, and music. The sound of jazz spilling from an army jeep felt like a voice from another planet. For years they had heard only the rhythm of marching boots and the endless speeches of the Führer. Now there was swing, dancing, chewing gum, and a different kind of authority, friendly, casual, unpredictable. The contrast was irresistible, but beneath the warmth of that new world, shadows grew long, because every stolen kiss, every shared cigarette, every soft word whispered in English could mean social death once the neighbors found out. In small towns, gossip spread like wildfire. Old women leaned from broken windows to count how many times a certain soldier visited a certain door. Children were sent by parents to follow the Americans and report who they talked to. And when the news reached the men who had returned from the front, half-starved, defeated, stripped of dignity, the fury ignited. They had lost everything, and now they saw their own women laughing with the enemy. The humiliation burned deeper than hunger. To them, these romances were more than betrayal. They were proof that the war had broken not just their country, but their pride. So they punished the girls, sometimes violently, as if their shame could be erased by cruelty. The occupation authorities rarely intervened. The Americans saw the women as adults making choices, while German police often turned a blind eye. Society took justice into its own hands. The worst punishments were reserved for those who openly flaunted their relationships. In Darmstadt, witnesses recalled a young woman whose head was shaved while the crowd chanted Ami Hor. In Hamburg, a girl was stripped and tied to a lamppost, her body smeared with tar. The violence was ritual, cathartic, an attempt by a broken nation to cleanse itself of impurity through humiliation. But behind every public act of revenge was private pain. Mothers weeping, sisters watching helplessly, fathers unable to lift their eyes. Yet even as hatred festered, life between the ruins continued. The black markets became meeting grounds. American soldiers traded coffee and stockings for favors, and in those dim-lit corners, real affection sometimes grew out of barter. Many relationships began as survival, but some evolved into love marked by tenderness that transcended language. Soldiers learned to say "Ich liebe dich," and girls tried to mimic "I love you" with awkward accents that made the men smile. They shared secrets in broken phrases, found warmth in silence, and discovered that love didn't need perfect grammar. It only needed two people who refused to surrender to despair. But this fragile intimacy lived under constant threat. Military police raided rooms at night, searching for fraternization violations. German families forbade daughters from going near American camps. And when a woman was found pregnant, the situation became unbearable. the stigma of bearing an AMI child was worse than poverty. Many were thrown out of their homes, forced into overcrowded shelters, or sent to religious institutions that treated them as sinners. Hospitals refused them at times, calling them collaborators. Some, overwhelmed by shame, took their own lives or abandoned their newborns at orphanages, praying the children might have a chance at a future they themselves had lost. Those who survived learned to hide their past. They moved to new towns, invented stories about absent German fiancés or dead husbands. They tore up photographs, burned letters, buried their memories under layers of silence. But not all chose to hide. A small number of these women fought for recognition of their love. They visited military offices, pleading for marriage papers, demanding to be allowed to join their American lovers overseas. For them, the promise of a new life was worth enduring the scorn. In 1946 and 1947, as marriage bans eased, the first transports of German war brides departed for the United States. Their faces were pale, eyes red from sleepless nights, yet inside they carried something no one could confiscate. Hope. Hope, however, was fragile across the ocean. Many found that the fairy tales whispered in ruined houses did not survive the long voyage. America was not always kind to German women. The war had left deep scars, and for many American families, a German bride was a painful reminder of lost sons and brothers. Some women faced cold stares, others outright rejection. They struggled with language, with isolation, and with husbands who often tried to forget their past. And yet many endured. They built lives in silence, raising children who spoke English but looked like both worlds. For them, assimilation became a second battlefield, one fought without guns, but with endurance. Back in Germany, those who stayed faced a different war, one of survival and memory. The post-war years blurred the lines between guilt and victimhood. Official narratives ignored them. History books had no place for women who had loved the enemy. The country wanted to rebuild its dignity, not confront its shame. So their stories disappeared into whispers, their names erased from family records. Only decades later, when Germany began to face its post-war trauma more openly, did historians start searching for their testimonies. What emerged was not scandal but tragedy, the quiet suffering of women who had been punished for doing the most human thing imaginable, seeking affection amid devastation. One such woman, known only as Maria, left a diary found years later in a Frankfurt attic. In it, she wrote of her American lover, a soldier named Thomas who brought her a loaf of bread on Christmas Eve 1945. She described how they met by chance while she was searching for her missing brother. Over months they shared laughter and fear, always in secret, when her father discovered. He beat her so severely she could barely walk. Thomas tried to intervene, but was transferred to another unit. Weeks later, Maria never saw him again. The last line of her diary read, "I loved him, and for that, I am the enemy of both sides." There were thousands of Marias across Germany. Their love stories were never written in history textbooks, but they shaped the fragile peace that followed, because through these forbidden relationships, the barriers of hate began to crumble quietly. Every smile, every shared meal between former enemies softened the edges of vengeance. Even if society condemned them, their actions planted seeds of understanding, and in the decades that followed, when Europe rebuilt itself from the ashes, it was these small acts of connection that silently held the foundation together. The story of the German girls who loved American soldiers is not simply about betrayal or romance. It's about the cost of humanity in times when humanity was outlawed. They were condemned for being too human, too emotional, too willing to forgive before forgiveness was fashionable. Their punishment came not from the victors but from their own people who could not bear to see them love what they were taught to hate. And so, they became the quiet ghosts of post-war Germany, unspoken, unseen, but always there, reminding the world that sometimes love survives where ideology dies. For them, the war did not end in 1945. It lingered in every stare, every whisper, every scar they carried into old age. Some died alone, their stories buried with them. Others lived long enough to tell their children about the American who once made them feel alive when everything else was dead. And perhaps, in those confessions, they finally found peace. Not forgiveness from others, but forgiveness from themselves. Because love, even forbidden love, had been their only rebellion against the darkness. By 1947, Germany was changing, but not for the women who had loved the Americans. The rubble was being cleared, the flags replaced, and the world slowly forgot its hatred, at least on the surface. Yet, for those girls branded as Ameliebchen, the scars had not healed. Their reputations were ruined beyond repair. They were no longer seen as victims of war but as symbols of shame. Some could not find work, others were expelled from schools or forced out of their family homes. The same nation that had worshipped a madman now demanded moral purity from the powerless. And in this moral cleansing, love became the new crime. The violence shifted from the public squares to private lives. Behind closed doors, brothers beat their sisters, mothers disowned their daughters, and fathers refused to speak their names. These were not isolated acts. They were symptoms of a broken society trying to rebuild its pride by destroying those who had shown vulnerability. The men who had lost the war needed to feel strong again, and so they punished the only ones they could still control. The women bore the weight of Germany's defeat in their own flesh. Their bodies had become the battleground where pride and humiliation fought their last war. For many of these women, silence became survival. They learned to lie fluently, to erase the English words they once whispered in the dark, to burn the letters that once smelled of cigarettes and rain. Some even reinvented their entire identities, moving to cities where no one knew their past. Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich. These cities swallowed the guilty and the innocent alike, offering anonymity in exchange for forgetting. But forgetting was a luxury not everyone could afford. The children born from these relationships, those with lighter hair, darker skin, or unfamiliar names, became living reminders that the past could never truly be buried. The occupation children faced an invisible war of their own. Teachers mocked them, other children threw stones, and priests called them cursed. Some were even denied baptism, as if their souls were half foreign. Their mothers watched in silence, too afraid to fight back, knowing that one wrong word could cost them everything. In 1948, social workers recorded an alarming rise in suicides among these mothers, women who saw no future for themselves or their children. A few sought help from American officers, begging for recognition or financial support. Most were turned away. The war brides who made it to America were the exception. The rest remained ghosts in their own country. Meanwhile, the American soldiers, those who had once promised love and forever, had moved on. Some returned home and never wrote again. Others sent letters that never arrived. The postal system was broken, and so were the promises. But a few men kept their word. They filed for marriage permission, endured the bureaucracy, and returned for their German lovers. These were rare stories, but they burned brightly in the darkness. A handful of these couples built lives that defied the hatred around them. Their homes became quiet sanctuaries where laughter existed again, where jazz records played in rooms that once echoed with sirens. Yet even their happiness carried the shadow of loss. For every love that survived, hundreds had died in silence. As Germany split into East and West, the fate of these women diverged. In the Soviet zone, fraternization with Americans was treated as political treason. Women accused of collaboration with the capitalist enemy were arrested or sent to labor camps. Those in the Western zones fared little better. Social stigma persisted long after the occupation ended. The irony was cruel. While governments debated the reconstruction of Europe, ordinary women fought private wars for dignity and belonging. They were erased from national memory because their existence did not fit the heroic narrative. The victors celebrated liberation, the defeated mourned their dead. But who mourned the girls who had simply tried to feel human? In the years that followed, West Germany underwent a transformation. The Marshall Plan brought food, jobs, and a new identity. The economy revived. Cities rose from ashes. And yet, beneath the new facades, there lingered a quiet hypocrisy. The same society that punished these women for moral corruption now embraced American culture wholeheartedly. Coca-Cola, Hollywood films, and jazz clubs flourished in the very places where women had once been beaten for holding an American's hand. The nation forgot its outrage, but the women could not forget their pain. Every advertisement featuring smiling American soldiers reminded them of a love they had been forced to bury alive. One woman, Elsa, remembered it vividly until her death. In her old age, she told her granddaughter about a soldier named Jack, who used to bring her canned peaches from his base near Nuremberg. They would eat them together by candlelight, laughing at their broken words and gestures. When she became pregnant, Jack promised to marry her. But before the paperwork cleared, his unit was relocated. He never returned, Elsa gave birth alone in a refugee shelter. The baby, a boy with dark eyes, was taken from her after 3 months by a welfare office that deemed her unfit. She spent the rest of her life searching for him. Her story was not unique. Thousands of such children disappeared into orphanages or were quietly adopted abroad, their identities erased as if they had never existed. The silence around these events lasted decades. Post-war Germany was obsessed with rebuilding, not remembering. Even historians avoided the subject. It was too sensitive, too tangled with shame. The women themselves rarely spoke. To admit such love was to reopen wounds society had ordered them to hide. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers began to uncover letters, diaries, and testimonies revealing the true scale of these forgotten relationships. What emerged was staggering. Over 190,000 German women were estimated to have had relationships with American soldiers between 1945 and 1950. Of those, tens of thousands bore children. Yet their names were missing from every official record. History had rendered them invisible. Their invisibility was their punishment. The men were remembered as liberators, the women as stains. But when survivors were finally interviewed in their old age, they did not speak with bitterness. They spoke with longing, with tears, with trembling smiles. Some still kept the gifts they'd received: an old comb, a faded photograph, a silver lighter engraved with initials. They spoke of laughter in the dark, of safety in strong arms, of the feeling that for one fleeting moment they were more than the rubble around them. Their voices cracked not from shame, but from remembering what it meant to be alive when the world was dead. By the time their stories reached the public, most of them were gone. Their children, those born of love and rejection, were the ones who demanded answers. Many of them grew up unaware of their fathers' identities, their mothers' pasts sealed in silence. When the archives opened, they found fragments, letters marked "Return to Sender," photographs of smiling soldiers holding babies they never met again. Some eventually traced their roots to the United States, reuniting with families who never knew they existed. These meetings, often emotional and awkward, revealed how deep the war's shadows still stretched across generations. In the end, the question of what happened to those German girls is not just a historical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting the cruelty of human morality under stress. They were punished not for what they did, but for what they symbolized: the collapse of ideological purity, the triumph of human connection over national hatred. Their crime was forgiveness, before the world was ready to forgive. Their love stories, buried for decades, tell us more about post-war Germany than any treaty or political speech ever could. They remind us that peace is never clean, and love is never simple. It grows in the cracks of devastation, fragile yet defiant. And though history tried to erase them, their memory persists. In the faded letters, in the silent photos, and in the faces of their children who inherited not only their features but their resilience. The world may not have given them justice, but in the quiet corners of memory they still live, proof that even in ruin, love endures longer than hate. By the early 1950s, Germany was no longer the land of ruins it had been. Streets were being rebuilt, families were reuniting, and life began to carry a strange normalcy. The rubble was being swept away, but not from memory. For the German women who had loved American soldiers, the past clung to them like the dust that never truly left the stones. They had lived through years of whispered judgments, through punishments both physical and emotional. Yet now, as the world moved on, they were left behind in silence, watching their country celebrate a recovery they had no part in. The pain of what they endured was buried under the triumph of the so-called economic miracle, as if the price of Germany's new future was forgetting those who had been shamed in its past. Some of these women tried to build new lives. They married, raised children, worked ordinary jobs, and pretended that nothing had ever happened. But the scars remained, quiet and deep. They could not speak of the love that had once sustained them, nor of the violence that had followed. When their husbands asked about the war years, they changed the subject. When their children asked about their fathers, they lied or stayed silent. Silence became their inheritance. In living rooms filled with new furniture and post-war optimism, they carried invisible wounds. The laughter around them often sounded distant, unreal, as if life had moved forward. But they were still standing in 1945, watching their younger selves walk through the ruins with trembling hands. reaching out for a forbidden touch. For those who had borne children from their American lovers, the struggle was worse. The so-called brown babies, children born to black American soldiers and German mothers, faced especially harsh prejudice. The racism that the Nazis had preached for 12 years did not die with the regime, it lingered in ordinary hearts. These children were stared at in schools, whispered about on trams, and sometimes taken away from their mothers altogether. Many were sent to orphanages or given up for adoption in the United States through quiet arrangements that were never recorded. Their mothers, already ostracized for their love, now faced the unbearable loss of their children too. Some received letters years later from American families thanking them for the gift. Others never heard anything again. The silence, again, became the final cruelty. Even in the occupied zones, the difference between survival and disgrace could be decided by a single rumor. In rural towns, decades later, old villagers still remembered who had gone with the Americans. They said it with contempt, as if it were a permanent stain. These stories survived longer than the war itself. In many ways, the moral battles of post-war Germany lasted far longer than the physical ones. The women who had loved the enemy became the convenient scapegoats for an entire generation's guilt. It was easier for the public to condemn them than to confront their own complicity in what Germany had done. The nation needed to rebuild its moral identity, and so it did what frightened societies always do. It punished women for their humanity. But time is relentless. The men who shouted insults grew old. The women who once hid their faces aged quietly into grandmothers. With age came a strange kind of freedom. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Germany began confronting its Nazi past more openly, some of these women began to speak. Journalists started collecting testimonies. Small articles appeared in local papers. A few brave women stood before cameras and told the truth. One of them, a woman named Inga from Stuttgart, said in an interview, "They called me a whore for loving a man who gave me food when my own people gave me stones." Tell me, who was the enemy then? Her words shocked many, because they stripped away decades of lies. These women had not betrayed their country. Their country had betrayed them. For historians, these stories became essential to understanding the real human cost of victory and defeat. They revealed the hypocrisy hidden beneath post-war reconstruction, the moral double standards that demanded female purity while excusing male brutality. Some of the men who had jeered at the women later worked for the same American firms that rebuilt the German economy. The very soldiers they had despised became their employers. The irony was cruel but fitting. The world always finds ways to forgive men for war but not women for love. As the 20th century moved on, a quiet re-evaluation began. Academics and filmmakers started to explore the forgotten chapters of post-war intimacy. Documentaries like Love in the Ruins and Children of the Occupation exposed the emotional and psychological fallout that lingered long after the bombs stopped falling. Elderly women, their hands trembling with age, showed faded photographs of young American soldiers smiling in dusty streets. Their voices cracked as they recalled moments of kindness amid chaos. For many, speaking publicly was an act of liberation, a way of reclaiming dignity stolen decades before. Yet, even as they spoke, there was a sense that their stories had come too late. Most of their lovers were gone, most of their accusers long dead, and the children they once held in secret had lives of their own. The children, now adults, became the bridge between past and present. Many sought to uncover the truth of their origins. They traveled to archives, interviewed veterans, searched through adoption files. Some found fathers who had never known they existed, others found gravestones instead. Their journeys were filled with both hope and grief. In their faces, one could see the echoes of two worlds: German mothers who suffered in silence, and American fathers who moved on without knowing the weight they left behind. Each reunion or discovery was a reminder that war's aftermath does not end when the treaties are signed. It lives on through generations. For the women who survived into old age, the memories softened, but never vanished. Some said they still dreamed of the soldiers they loved, the smell of their uniforms, the sound of laughter echoing in destroyed buildings, the brief illusion that the world could be kind again. Others said they no longer remembered his face, only the feeling of safety they once had. That, more than anything, defined their story. Safety. In a time when everything was chaos, love, however forbidden, had been the only refuge. It was not betrayal, it was survival. Their legacy today exists not in monuments or textbooks, but in the quiet persistence of their humanity. Modern Germany rarely speaks of them, yet their existence remains a moral shadow over the nation's post-war identity. They remind us that history is not written only by generals and politicians. It is written in the trembling hands of women who dared to care when caring was forbidden. If one listens closely to the old ruins of Cologne or the back streets of Nuremberg, one might still imagine them there. Young, defiant, frightened but alive, their laughter mixing with the echoes of boots, their whispers defying the silence imposed upon them. The world around them wanted vengeance. They chose connection. The world demanded purity. They chose compassion. That choice, though it cost them everything, was what made them human again in a time when humanity itself was nearly extinct. As the decades passed, and Germany became one of the strongest democracies in the world, these forgotten women remained its most haunting lesson. They proved that even in victory, cruelty survives. Even in peace, justice can be denied. And yet, they also proved that love, even forbidden love, can endure longer than hatred. Their story is not one of scandal but of courage, because in loving the enemy they remembered what the world had forgotten, that compassion is not treason and kindness is never defeat. When the last of them dies, their stories will fade into dust, but somewhere in the quiet corners of history, their voices will still whisper through time. We loved when it was forbidden, and for that we were condemned, but we loved nonetheless. By the late decades of the 20th century, the story of the German girls who loved American soldiers had all but disappeared from the mainstream narrative of post-war history. The world had chosen simpler stories, of villains and heroes, of nations rebuilt and evil defeated. But these women existed in the grey zone between victory and ruin, between forgiveness and shame. They did not fit the clean lines of historical redemption. They were living proof that even after the guns fell silent, the war had not truly ended. It had simply moved into hearts, into homes, and into the memories of those who could never forget. Some of them lived quiet, ordinary lives. They grew old in small towns where no one dared mention the past, where silence was safer than honesty. They learned to fold the years neatly like laundry, keeping the memory of their American lovers hidden between the layers. A few became widows of German men who never knew that once, long ago, they had kissed a soldier from another world. Others never married, never found anyone who could match the tenderness of those brief moments after the war, when everything had been broken, and yet somehow, for a little while, alive again. For them, that love was not a scandal. It was a secret prayer whispered against the ruins. As the 1980s and 1990s arrived, a new generation of Germans began asking questions their parents had avoided. The grandchildren of war wanted to know what had really happened. Not the patriotic version, not the official story, but the human one. Slowly, doors that had been locked for half a century began to open. Diaries were discovered in attics. Boxes of letters unearthed from basements. Faded photographs found between the pages of family Bibles. A pattern emerged. Young women, most barely adults, who had fallen in love not with conquerors, but with the first men who treated them with gentleness after years of fear and indoctrination. These were not traitors. They were survivors seeking a fragment of humanity in a landscape stripped of it. Yet even as the truth surfaced, many survivors hesitated to speak. The shame was not gone. Time had aged them, but memory kept them young and frightened. When journalists asked about their experiences, some laughed nervously and said, "Oh, that was a long time ago," as if distance could erase the pain. But for those who did speak, the stories poured out like a flood that had been waiting behind a dam for decades. They spoke of soldiers who shared their rations, who helped repair broken doors, who taught them swing dances under shattered ceilings. They spoke of nights filled with fear of discovery, of running barefoot through bombed streets to meet a man they weren't supposed to love. And they spoke of what came after, the violence, the humiliation, the years of exile within their own country. One woman, named Hildegard, recalled how her entire village turned on her after she was seen walking hand in hand with an American near the river. The next morning, her hair was hacked off in front of the town square. Her mother wept while the men laughed. "They called me a disgrace," she said in an interview recorded when she was 83. But what they never understood was that he had saved me, not just from hunger, but from despair. He made me feel human again. Her story, like so many others, revealed a deep contradiction that Germany itself struggled to face. The idea that compassion could come from the enemy and cruelty could come from one's own people as the century-turned historians finally began to name these women, not as collaborators, but as casualties of moral hypocrisy. Books and documentaries reframed their experiences as a vital part of post-war reconstruction. They showed how these forbidden relationships, in their quiet way, helped soften the hatred between occupier and occupied. Through small acts of intimacy, a bridge had been built across the ruins, and while governments signed treaties, it was these invisible bridges, made of whispered words and trembling hands, that truly began to heal Europe's emotional wounds. But history, written by men and institutions, had no place for such fragile architecture. Only now, through the persistence of their descendants, were these bridges being rediscovered. For the children born of those loves, the story was different. Many grew up in confusion, half belonging to two worlds that didn't want them. Some faced ridicule, others invisibility. They were the generation without fathers, or with fathers whose names were only half remembered. Yet as adults they began searching. Some found their American families, others simply found the truth, and that truth gave them peace. For them, knowing was enough, knowing that they were not mistakes, not products of shame, but the result of a love that defied a world of hatred. Their existence, once hidden, became the most undeniable proof that even in the ruins of war, love had refused to die. And still, not all endings were redemptive. Some of these women died before they could see their stories reclaimed, their letters burned, their names forgotten, their faces unrecorded. The quiet tragedies of their lives echo the wider tragedy of post-war Europe, how easily humanity is erased when it complicates the narrative of good and evil. Theirs is a history that asks uncomfortable questions. What is loyalty when morality itself collapses? Who decides which kind of love is acceptable after the world has burned? In their final years, many of these women spoke of dreams that returned to them at night. In those dreams, the bombs never fell, and the city was whole again. They walked through streets lined with light instead of smoke. They saw the soldier waiting for them, smiling like he once did under the flicker of a ruined lamppost. They said they never forgot the smell of the leather jacket, the feel of a cigarette passed from one hand to another, the sound of laughter amid sirens. Those were the memories they carried to their graves, the memories that no amount of shame could erase. Today, when we look back, it's easy to judge from the safety of distance. But to understand them, one must step into the world they lived in, a world where food was worth more than gold, where fear was constant, where survival meant compromise. In such a world, love was both dangerous and sacred. These women were not heroes or villains. They were simply human. They reached for warmth in the coldest chapter of history, and the world punished them for it. That is their tragedy, but also their truth. Germany's post-war story cannot be told honestly without them. They represent the cost of moral reconstruction, the human debris swept aside so that nations could claim purity again. Yet in their pain lies something larger. The lesson that peace built on denial is no peace at all. The real rebuilding of a nation begins not with concrete and steel, but with the courage to remember those who were silenced. In the archives of Munich, there exists a faded black and white photograph. A young German woman standing beside an American soldier in 1946. The background is rubble, the air thick with smoke. She looks both frightened and free. He looks tired but smiling. Their hands touch, not in possession but in understanding. It's an image without victory or defeat, without politics, without ideology. Just two people, caught between worlds, trying to find something human in the wreckage. That image says more about post-war Europe than any treaty or speech ever could. And perhaps that is the enduring power of their story. It is not about shame, it is about resilience. It is about how love, no matter how condemned, becomes a quiet rebellion against despair. These women did not rebuild cities, they rebuilt something greater. The capacity to feel after years of indoctrinated numbness. Their forbidden love, fragile as it was, became the first seed of post-war reconciliation. Every smile exchanged, every moment of tenderness shared between enemies, was an act of defiance against the hatred that had consumed the world. In the end, their legacy is both haunting and hopeful. haunting because it reveals how cruelty can hide beneath the banner of morality, hopeful because it proves that even in the ashes humanity can still flicker alive. They remind us that history's truest lessons often come not from battlefields, but from quiet rooms, from secret letters, from the trembling hands of those who dared to love when the world demanded hate. The German girls who loved American soldiers were not saints. They were flawed, fragile, and frightened, like everyone else who lived through that shattered age. But they were also brave, braver than their accusers, braver than the men who mocked them, braver than the politicians who wrote them out of history. Their courage was not the kind that wins medals, it was the kind that endures silence. It was the courage to remember, to feel, to forgive. And so, when we ask what happened to them, the answer is simple. They lived, they suffered, they endured. Some loved and lost, others carried that love quietly until their last breath. They were punished for being human in an inhuman time, but their humanity outlasted the hate that tried to erase them. Their names may fade, but their truth remains, echoing across the decades. Love is never a crime, even when history insists it is.